She interviewed Hitler, outwitted Göring, and she smuggled the truth out of Nazi Germany one story at a time. Sigrid Schulz was an undercover force of nature, reporting and warning Americans about the rise of Hitler before anyone thought it was a threat. During World War II, she stayed in Germany to make sure that the Americans could know the truth of what was really happening. Every single day she risked her life. Every single day was a day that she could get arrested by the secret police. But still, she didn't give up and she kept on reporting. In this episode, I talked to historian Pamela Toler, who wrote a fascinating book about Sigrid Schulz. This story is absolutely incredible, and I really know that you're gonna love this, so enjoy. Before we start this episode, you probably love history, that's why you're watching. Well, I made a free list of 100 history books that will completely change your life. The link is in the description, go download it, and now enjoy the episode. So in your book, you wrote, she was one of the first reporters, male or female, to warn American readers of the growing dangers of Nazism. She published at least 166 articles about Hitler and the rise of the Nazi Party before he became Germany's chancellor. So she was reporting on Hitler like years before any American knew his name. Where do you think that came from? Like that she was able to already see that he wasn't the good guy as some Americans actually thought he was before the Second World War.
Well, she was deeply embedded in Germany, far more so than most of the American reporters were there. She had grown up in Europe, even though she was American, and she ended up being caught in Berlin during World War I. So she had this really extensive network of people. So she was hearing about Hitler and the Nazis from a lot of different sources, many of which other American reporters would not have had access to.
Mm-hmm.
And also she really did not believe in either right or left. She was a fan of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And he was so clearly against democracy from very early on. And he wasn't the only German. I mean, there was a period when Germany was going through some rough political times, and Mussolini was looking like a golden boy. It looked like life was so much better in Italy under Mussolini than before Mussolini. So people were saying, maybe we need a strong man. And so and there were a lot of candidates early on. Hitler was only one of many, and maybe not the most important one from her perspective. But she took the time to understand all of them. And again, she really did not believe a dictatorship was the answer.
Mm. Yeah, you just noted her network that she was able to really communicate with these people. That was also the language thing, right? She was fluent in German.
Mhm.
How much did that help her with understanding what the situation was?
Enormously. I mean, so many reporters either had no German or had only a basic knowledge of German. So they ended up being really reliant on translators and on local tipsters to get them interviews, to get them sources. She didn't need anyone to feed her those sources. She had those sources, and I mean, she clearly worked with local people, some of whom were bringing her stories, but her relationship to that was very different than the people who were carefully learning German. One of the most well-known reporters in Berlin during that period was William Shirer, who later wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and in an interview with him, he talked about going to parties at her house, that she and her mother threw, but he said, his German really wasn't good enough to understand everything that was going on at those parties, and yet he's an important reporter. So it really does make a huge difference. She's seeing nuances other people aren't seeing. She's got access to sources other reporters don't have.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the most interesting names you mentioned in your book, who was also, I think he also visited the house, was Göring, right?
Right.
That's so weird to think about that Göring would be at your dinner table giving you information.
But, after the Nazis first became a powerful force in the Reichstag, she decided she needed to find a Nazi source, someone high up in the the hierarchy that she could talk to, and she actually sent her assistant out to find someone, and the person he came back with was Hermann Göring, and her next step was to be sure that his table manners were acceptable. So she took him to dinner, or to lunch a couple of times at a well-known restaurant, and she said, he ate an enormous amount, but the bill was horrible, but that his table manners were acceptable, and after that, he would be invited to these parties at her house. Those parties were enormously important, just sometimes seemed like everyone in Berlin came to those parties. So having Göring there wasn't entirely, he was one among many, but he ends up being a source, and a source for a long time, even when he was clearly not always giving her a straight story. He would be giving her enough information that she could sift through it and find some elements of truth for her to then track down.
Because what do you exactly mean by that he was a source? Like, was he, like, did the Nazi Party know that he was giving information? Like, what type of source was he? What was
Well, he certainly wasn't giving her
classified
secrets.
information? Oh, okay,
Right, he
okay.
wasn't giving her classified information. He was, however, giving her access at a deeper level than some of the others were getting, and he was also trying to feed her lies. He was trying to feed her propaganda, and that goes
Mm,
both ways when you've got a source who's a political
yeah. Was
animal.
that the reason of their relationship, you could say? Like, both of them
Right.
propaganda in each other?
Yeah, the idea that information went both ways, that he could feed her information he wanted her to have, that she could try to get information she wanted. And
Mm,
certainly they weren't friends. That's absolutely clear that they were not friends, but he was a useful source.
mm. And so how long did they have communication for? Was that like the whole war, or was that only from just before the war?
I think it really ended once the war began, that they had personal conversations.
Mhm.
And then her final interview with him was after he was captured at the end of the war. It wasn't a personal interview, but it was a set of American correspondents who were given an opportunity to interview him. There's a wonderful picture. She's right in the front row. I'm sure partially she got that seat because she was the only woman there, also because she was only 5'2" and wanted to be sure she could see.
Mhm.
But, she would in that interview, she referred back to other interviews saying, "Well, you're telling us now that you didn't know anything about the concentration camps, but in 1930, you were telling me that you needed the concentration camps and why." So she was calling him out on lies there. She'd been talking to him for a long time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think like if you have such a long story with someone like Goering, you can easily like pick things out from back in the past. And like,
Mhm.
do we have any idea of what his reaction was towards her saying those type of things?
At that interview, he did not explode. He basically tried to just move on to the next question and not respond. There were earlier times when he did explode when she called him on something. In fact, that's how she got the nickname the Dragon from Chicago, was because she called him out in a public space about, this program isn't quite the right word, but he was trying to arrange for foreign correspondents to get trapped by feeding them stories that were more like that were secrets, military secrets. And she called him out on it at a foreign press club meeting, and he did lose his temper then.
Mm.
Um, and after that, he and his staff called her that dragon from Chicago. Um, that
Because
may be the point at which their relationship became a little frayed.
yeah, I mean, it is a cool nickname. I wouldn't necessarily see it as an insult.
Yeah, and I don't think she did.
Hmm. Um, like in order for people to trust her, like why was she chosen to like have, for instance, an interview with Hitler from the so many other American reporters who could have done that? Was it her fluency in German or was it something else?
Some of it was her fluency in German, some of it was, again, her long-standing network among within Germany, so that she had contacts in the government, and early on, he was willing to do interviews in a way that he wasn't later, and I think the other thing is she was actually very well known. I mean,
Hmm.
the fact that she was largely forgotten later does not mean that she was not an important player in the field, and, Chicago had a large German-based population, both German immigrants, but also descendants of German immigrants, and many Germans in the surrounding area who also got the paper. So, having an interview with her gave him an audience that he had reason to want to reach.
Mm-hmm. I can also imagine like her feeling a sense of fear too, because I mean she's interviewing people like Göring, like Hitler. Where did that fearlessness come from? Especially as you just mentioned, like a woman who's 5'2".
You know, I think at some point the fearlessness came from believing so strongly in what she was doing.
Mm.
And I think there were times when she was afraid and just reported anyway. Certainly by the end of her time in Berlin, she was beginning to fear for her personal safety. But, her first time that she got summoned to the Gestapo was really interesting because she gets a letter that says, "Come on Monday at a time of your choice, da, 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 da." She shows up, and she's not worried going in. She sends a letter to the paper's owner, Colonel McCormick, saying, "I've got this appointment, but I haven't done anything in particular to make them angry, and everything I say is true and accurate, so what are they gonna do?" She does take the time to go to the American consulate and say, again, "I've got this appointment." But she gets there and he's not there, the guy who called her in, and instead of just sitting and waiting for him, she says, "I'll come back when I have a real appointment. I don't have time for this." And she's telling the Gestapo, "I'm sorry, I don't have time to talk to you." Some of that is just an awareness of her own of herself, certain amount of self-respect, and this unrealistic sense that being accurate and reporting only the truth is a safety net for her. When she finally meets with them, I think she becomes a little less believing that the truth is going to be a shield that she can stand behind. But for that first one going in, I mean, she went in with absolute fearlessness, even though other reporters had already been arrested more than once. Um, so, yeah, some of it was just a belief in what she was doing, I think.
Yeah, I can't imagine just being so fearless and against someone like the Gestapo. You also mentioned in your book the story about the envelope, right? Could
Right.
you share that one?
Sure. It's one of my favorite stories about her. Again, the Nazis were frustrated because they hadn't been able to control the American press the way they were controlling the German press. So Goering set up this this plan to try and entrap foreign journalists. And one day, a man dropped off a package at their apartment, the apartment she shared with her mother, and he told her mother, "Oh, don't worry about calling her, it's not that urgent, she can see it when she gets home." Well, her days were long because of the time difference between Chicago and Berlin, and Hedwig knew that's her mother, Hedwig, knew that time was always important, so she immediately called Sigrid and said, "There's this package here." And Sigrid suspected it was a Nazi trap. So she hurried home. Sure enough, as soon as she opened the letter, she found what looked like plans for an airplane engine. And she knew she didn't have much time, that the Gestapo was probably already on its way. So she shoved the package and all the pages into the fireplace and waited until they had been burned down entirely to ash. Then she headed back to the office. And on the way back, sure enough, she ran into a man who was someone that she had suspected of being involved in these efforts to entrap journalists. In fact, she had thrown him out of her own office in recent weeks for trying to peddle a story that was more appropriate for a spy than a journalist. And he was clearly headed to their apartment. He was accompanied what she described as 2 shady figures who she was sure were Gestapo agents, and she just stepped right in their path and said, "Don't even bother. There's nothing there. You won't find anything." And then she called a cab, hailed a cab, and in this loud voice, to be sure they'd hear, said, "Take me to the American consulate." She immediately went to report on the attempt.
Mm. And how did the American consulate react to it? Were they still like in denial?
Um, I don't know that they were in denial at that point. I don't she's the one who tells the story, so I don't have what the
Mm-hmm.
American consulate thought. Um, it's an interesting balance because there were certainly people who were professional diplomats who had been in Germany a long time who were slow to acknowledge just how bad the Nazis were. The American ambassador, who obviously is not a career diplomat and um, who did not stay very long. He found the Nazis very difficult to deal with. He was a historian, who had been a young scholar and studied in Germany, had this love of the Germany he remembered, but hated the Nazis. So he was very anti-Nazi almost from the moment he arrived. So there's differing positions in the embassy at that point. Uh, but we don't know how they reacted other than she put them on notice, and they did agree that something needed to be said, but had not quite decided the best way to do that yet.
Yeah. I think like what I noticed most about studying her is just her people skills. She really understood people. What I found the most interesting story was well, I'd say like the most creative story was the bar story where she came up with that fake drink. Could you tell us about that? Like, what was the reasoning for
Sure,
that? What was her
sure.
motivation?
It's soon after she becomes a Tribune reporter, and she grew up in a time and a place and a social class in which respectable women didn't go to bars, not even nice bars, unless they were with their husband or their father, or if they were gonna be really wild, maybe an uncle or a brother or a fiancé, and at that point, she really couldn't use her boss as a chaperone, but she needed to be in that place. The bar at the Hotel Adlon was pretty much the informal clubhouse for foreign reporters in Berlin. They had lunches with politicians, they met up with informants, they shared tips, they chased rumors, they bitched about their, bosses back home, and if she wanted to be taken seriously as part of that world, she needed to be able to go into that bar and order a drink and be comfortable. But she knew she couldn't match the male reporters drink for drink. I mean, she wasn't anti-alcohol. Her family had always had alcohol around, definitely not a dry household, and her father had even spent time helping her train her palate for fine wines and was determined that she have a feel for how much alcohol she could handle. S but, so she's not against alcohol, but again, she's only 5'2", and at that point, she was still really underweight from the hungry days of being in Berlin during World War I when food was really an issue. So she made a deal with the bartender at the Adlon to serve her non-alcoholic drinks that looked like the real thing. So if she ordered a Schultz, she got an orange juice-based mocktail. If anybody else ordered a Schultz, he got what looked like exactly the same drink, except it would include a heavy dose of alcohol, and it meant she was able to give the impression that she was a hard-drinking newsman just like the rest of them.
This is so creative, especially for like a woman in that industry. Like you must be able to think that way, otherwise you're not going to survive in that world, I think.
I think that's very true.
Was it? Do you think the woman thing was for her something that held her back, or did it maybe even give her some advantages in some moments as she stood out obviously because of it?
I mean, there were lots of challenges. Even today, while being a woman may occasionally give you some advantages, for the most part, you have more disadvantages than
Mm.
advantages. I mean, that's just the nature of a male-dominated industry, a male-dominated world. So she definitely had to deal with sexism in very basic forms. I mean,
Mm.
she now and then would open her eyes real wide and say, "Sir, what do you mean?" So she would occasionally play the female card when it got her out of a difficult situation,
Mm.
but it caused her more trouble than not, and which she did not later acknowledge, it's got to be said. When people ask her about it later, she'd say, "Oh, well, it never stopped me from doing anything. I got my job because I'm good at it, and the boys accepted that." But when you read her letters from the time, it's very clear she was regularly dealing with, um, microaggressions, but also with, real aggressions as well.
And with letters, you mean like private letters? You were
Yeah,
able to
private
use that as a
letters.
source?
Yes, I was able to use that as a source, which was wonderful. A large number of her papers are held at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison, Wisconsin. She was a pack rat, so they got just boxes of stuff. There's everything in there, Christmas cards, birthday cards, copies of her, astrological readings from a particular day, but also many, many, many letters,
Mm.
and a lot of them were work-based, but there were personal ones as well, and in the personal ones, she sometimes makes it very clear just how hard it could be being a woman in a man's world.
Yeah. Did you also see in the personal letters a bit of anger and sadness towards the fact that the Americans weren't taking Hitler serious yet in the beginning? Did you find that type of knowledge in the letters?
Not so much in the personal letters as in letters about her work.
Mm.
I also was able to read a lot of letters to and from her boss in Chicago, and yeah, she made that clear that there were times where she had stories she really wanted to tell in order to counteract this sense that maybe the Nazis weren't that bad. She certainly was upset when Lindbergh, with the pilot, as opposed to Hindenburg, the president, but when Lindbergh was there and was being tooled around by the Nazis, they were telling him exactly what they wanted him to hear. She actually went to the military attaché again at the embassy and said, "We've gotta pull him back. This is horrible." And the military attaché said, "Because he's here, we're getting to see things we would otherwise never see. We need this." So she didn't write about the fact that Lindbergh is being taken advantage of, but she clearly felt it. Um Certainly, she was very upset after Americans came back from the Berlin Olympics of 1936. You know, the Nazis basically turned Berlin into a theme park version of itself. They
This still
l
happens these days.
yeah, they literally whitewashed the walls the buildings next to the train station where foreigners would be coming in. They moved Jews and gypsies and poor people out of the city so that they were not seen. They had people take down signs that said "No Jews allowed." You know, they really did this short-term cleanup. So, Americans who were there came back and said, "You know, we don't understand what these reporters are talking about. It's clean, it's organized, people are friendly, they're polite." You know, they said, "The Nazis just aren't that bad." She was furious and really tried hard to counter that.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny how human nature just never changes. Like I remember it was a story, I think it was LA or something, like a couple of years ago, and they did this summit, and suddenly there were no homeless people anymore.
Right.
Incredible. And like by studying the letters, was there anything like surprising that you found? It could be just about her personality, or could be something like a thought that surprised you, what she wrote down.
I think the most powerful one for me, which I'm not sure surprised me is the right word, but it certainly made me understand how she was responding to something better than I had before I read it. Yeah, the Nazis invaded Norway in, April 1940. It's the end of the phony war, the beginning of the real thing, and, you know, she was half Norwegian. Her father was Norwegian, she'd spent summers in Norway, there were people there she loved, and I knew there had to be something out there that told me how she would feel about it, but I hadn't seen it on my first pass through, and it certainly didn't show in her reporting. Her reporting is still very I mean, she's making it clear how bad it is, but she's not giving any of her personal response. But a few days after the invasion, she wrote to her mother, "I wrote so colorlessly about things I care so much about that I suffer." They said, not a surprise, and yet such a powerful statement about what it was like to be in Berlin reporting on that war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they also used to do like via, right? So you used to write down and then send it to Paris, I believe, and then from Paris it goes to America. Like, what did that look like? There are ways of trying to go around.
Well, sending it to Paris was something that was actually a technical issue because the wire from Berlin to the United States, at least early on, was not as reliable as the wire from Paris or from London. So the instructions were from Chicago to send all your stories through
Mm,
Paris, because early on there was a second version. I mean, there's the Tribune Foreign Service, but at the same time, there's also the Tribune Paris edition, which was written it was an English language paper published in Paris for American visitors and expatriates. And a lot of her stories would then get published in that paper as well before they sent them on. So sending it to Paris wasn't so much a way of getting news out that
mm,
otherwise would have gotten out, and in some cases, it was almost a detriment. Um, yeah, that sh when she would send a story to Paris and then it would go to the United States, if it was a story that she would describe as hot, by the time it got back to Berlin in the paper, it was a couple of weeks old, so she was less apt to get in trouble, but sometimes they would publish it in Paris, which meant it was a new story under her name, and they wouldn't soften it at all. Those stories got her in trouble more often than not. But she had other ways of getting stuff out. She would go across the border before the Nazis had taken over surrounding countries and would send her stories from the Netherlands, from Prague, sometimes from Poland. Pretty early on, she stopped using Austria because even before the Anschluss, Austria became heavily Nazi and it wasn't so comfortable. So one thing she did was just literally go across the border, sometimes just for a few hours, and send a story that way.
Okay, that's
Sometimes she would send it out with a friend, so she'd send a written copy with a friend who was traveling out. Um, and ultimately, by the time the war was going on, she actually set up a dedicated phone line to Copenhagen and hired a secretary there to take the stories down in dictation and then send them to Chicago from Copenhagen. So she was always looking for ways around the constrictions.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, that makes it even more special that those stories got out, like, the work they had to put in. I mean, if there was a World War III going on right now, we just tweet about it, probably it would all be in real time.
Right, right.
Yeah, can we go a little deeper into the censorship? Like, what did that look like, the censorship climate in Nazi Germany, like early stages, let's say, um, just before World War, because reporters were still allowed to be in Germany.
Right.
What was she allowed to write about, and how did the Nazis also handle the writing? Like, did they filter it? What did that look like?
Well, there are 2 different versions of that. One is for print and one is for radio, and she did both.
Mm.
So for print, they didn't technically have censors going out, though sometimes they would just not send a story on. Um, but instead, they would kind of censor after the fact. So the story would get to the United States, it would run in a paper there, and then either Germans in the United States or German authorities in the United States would see something they thought was offensive or that should not have come out, and then they would contact the press office or the Gestapo back in Germany, and then they would get hauled in after the fact to get in trouble about a story that's already been printed. Which means that with as time goes on and it gets more dangerous, reporters end up self-censoring, watching every word to say, "Is this gonna get me in trouble?" Um, so that's one piece. The other piece is they tried to control what information people got. So they held 2 press conferences every day for foreign correspondents, feeding them information. I mean, Sigrid would go to them because you kind of had to, but she really had her own sources and did not find those particularly useful. The censorship was a lot more aggressive on the radio side. A reporter had to turn in their script 2 hours before they went on the air, and it had to get through a panel of 3 censors. One from the military, one from the propaganda office, and one from the main government press office. And, they would take things out, they would question things, and later they would even try to put stuff in, which she found particularly annoying. And then while she broadcast, they'd be sitting there with the edited script, making sure that she broadcast what had been approved. So the censorship was far more aggressive on the radio end, and I think that's partially because it was so immediate.
Mm. Yeah, I tried to listen to the broadcast. I found a clip on YouTube. It was very difficult to listen to, as in just understanding what she was trying to say. I could imagine, like, if you're like in their 40s, where you got like a probably worse speaker than my MacBook. How do you even like understand what she's saying? But I could see why the Nazis do feel like that might have been more danger, because there is something more real with a voice in comparison than writing.
Mhm.
Maybe it's
And
that.
in some cases, it's in real time. I mean, the first broadcast she does is from Munich at the time of the Munich conference, and she literally I mean, she has a broadcast at midnight where she basically has no news to report because the 4 powers have just then gone back into conference. So she's filling air time with sort of talking about how the 4 powers vary and then talking about why the conference is important. But 2.5 hours later, she's on the air right after they've signed the agreement forcing Czechoslovakia to give the Sudetenland to the Germans. I mean, she is giving real news in real time. It's very new. Broadcast journalism was so new. That's immediate. I can see why they want to control that, and a lot of American reporters would try to undermine what the censors did with tones of voice or with American slang. Um, and early on, that worked pretty well because the German censors that they had at first didn't have English that was good enough to catch slang, to catch baseball metaphors, to catch subtleties. As time went on, they got censors who were better at that, and that became less of a useful tool.
Mm. I love seeing like parallels in between like those days and now, because you can just clearly see how new media is always very scary for dictatorships. So
Absolutely.
for a Nazi regime, the broadcasting was terrifying. And then for, you could say, a Russia or whatever, during especially a war right now, block off Twitter, block off Facebook, block off Instagram. Like, I love seeing these parallels. That's so
Mhm.
fascinating.
Yeah,
Eventually, she also changes her name under certain articles, right? Could you
right.
tell me the origin of the name and what was the
Sure.
reasoning of changing it?
Well, she wanted a pseudonym so that she could write really dangerous stories, and the first one that she used it on came 1936, September, right after the Berlin Olympics, and the Chicago office sent a letter to Paris saying they'd like Sigrid to write an in-depth article on the Night of the Long Knives, which was really a massacre that had happened 2 years earlier. Hitler had massacred the leadership of the stormtroopers and then anyone he saw as a potential political rival, as well as a number of innocent people who got caught in the backlash. It was horrifying, it was terrifying, and they sent it to Paris, and Paris wasn't under Nazi control yet. So they didn't have this instinctive sense of just how dangerous it was. So first, the secretary at the Paris office called her at the office to give her the information, with just no sense that the phones were being tapped and probably recorded. And then the head of the Paris office made things worse by forwarding the original letter to her at home. And she knew the Nazis had read it because not only was the envelope open, but there were the censor stamps that were used for mail right on the envelope. So she knew it would be really dangerous to write the article, but she wanted to write it again because Americans had come to Berlin that summer and had been hoodwinked, basically, and we're thinking the Nazis weren't that bad, so she really wanted to write an article about this time that was just so horrifying, but she knew it was gonna be dangerous, so she used the fact that the Nazis were reading her stuff and told the Tribune that she couldn't write it, there was nothing new to say, she'd said everything that she had to say in the 12 articles that she wrote 2 years earlier. And then once she was sure the Nazis had gotten the message, she went to Paris and wrote the article in Paris. And when she shipped it to the United States from Paris, she sent it with the suggestion that they run it under somebody else's name so that she would be free to report the whole story without fear of Nazi retribution. And the name she suggested was John Dixon. And it was really a sly tribute to her first boss, the man who hired her at the Tribune, whose name was Dick Little. She had always considered him her father in journalism, and that made her Dick's son.
Mm.
And she used that pseudonym for the remainder of her time in Germany for the most dangerous reporting that she did, even though at the same time she was continuing to report on Nazi Germany using her own name, and she was making him pretty mad even with her own name.
I see. And with the reporting itself, like I think I heard you say somewhere that she also had to send like a male figure to do the investigation, right? Because they didn't let women do it or something along those lines.
There was a time when she had to do that. During the war, the Nazis began to organize press junkets to send, foreign reporters to the front. And they were carefully organized for them to see success after success, but they wouldn't let her go. The press junkets were all male, so she hired a young male reporter named John Raleigh to go on the press junkets with her for in her place. He wrote some articles himself, he brought some news back for her. It turned out that his German wasn't as good as they both thought it was, so he wasn't quite as successful as they would have hoped. But, yeah, she got around the not being allowed by sending a mail proxy.
Mm. And like with all the work that she's put in that you just mentioned, what do you think the effects of it were um, for the American people, as in like how much she was able to influence their thoughts and eventually change their mind?
That is a hard one.
Mm.
Um, in some ways, the amazing thing is that she was allowed to publish those articles at all because Colonel McCormick, again, the owner of the paper, disagreed with her about just about everything. He wasn't exactly pro-Nazi, but he was so anti-communist that he was willing to see the Nazis as a buffer. He was certainly an isolationist, he was anti-New Deal, he was anti-Roosevelt. The isolationism changed with the attack on Pearl Harbor, but nothing else did. But he didn't censor her articles. He didn't tell her what to write. He sometimes would say, "Yes, I'd like an article on this subject," but he didn't tell her what to say on it. Now, sometimes some of her most important articles would get published further back in the paper, um, and that tended to happen particularly early on because nobody really believed the Nazis were as bad as they were, so they weren't necessarily front page news from America's point of view, but she had several really important articles that ended up in the entertainment section, which was way back in the paper. And it's really hard to say at what point America began to believe. It's one of the things that is so incredible to us is that you've got reporters there. She was one of the first, but she certainly wasn't the only one writing about how bad it is, and editors saying, "It can't really be this bad. This can't be true."
Mm.
And then readers saying, "It can't be bad. This can't be true." Um, you I think the point at which people began to believe how bad it is once the American troops march into Germany.
That's very late.
It is very late.
Yeah. I think that's also like let's get into that too, like the when she was eventually like not 1945 doing the reporting. But before we get into that, could you like tell me some more about what did it look like her living in Nazi Germany too? Because you wrote in your book, she used rugs to build an adult version of a blanket fort around the stove. She raised rabbits for food on the balcony. The hard part, naturally, was to eat them. So her conditions that she endured must have been very, very hard, right?
Mhm.
In those
Well, and
moments.
those particular things were during World War One.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Because they were there as enemy aliens, and, we tend to forget how badly the Russian people suffered during World War One.
Yeah.
The f
And
there was
two.
so little food and so little fuel,
Mhm.
and, she worked the system for all it was worth during World War One. She was in somewhat better condition in World War II because she worked for the Tribune. She was getting paid in American dollars, which went very far. But even then, I mean, she came back to the United States in 1941. She got very ill and was told that part of the reason that it hit her so hard was that she was basically so malnourished as to be almost starving, and yet she was one of the lucky ones.
Mm. And like, what did the war for her look like when she eventually did return to America? What did she spend her years doing?
Well, partially she spent her years getting well.
Mhm.
She landed, and it turned out she had caught war typhus, probably on the boat, possibly on the train from Berlin to Portugal. I mean, she was very, very ill. She started to get better. She had her visa. She was ready to go back, and she got hit by a taxi in New York, seriously damaged a knee that had already been damaged by being hit by shrapnel while she was reporting in Berlin. So again, it takes her a long time to recover from that. But she writes a book. It's not a very good book by modern standards. It's not very readable, but it went into 2 printings. It was, it sold quite well at the time, and it's called Germany Will Try It Again, and she is making the argument that Germany is losing, but they are already making plans for the next war. She's telling a lot of stories in that book about her experiences with the Nazis. It's very hard for a modern reader to read, but she spent a lot of time doing that. She did some public speaking to groups. She got involved in helping sell bonds. Um, 'Cause there's a point at which it's hard for her to go back just because the Tribune already has their war reporting in place, so there's no obvious place to send her, and they're worried because she's a little older than the average war correspondent at that point, and she's just been really ill, and they're afraid that they'll send her back and she'll get really ill again, and then what happens? Um So but toward the end, they're thinking, "Well, we'll send you to Russia, and you'll work your way west from Russia so that you'll get to Berlin just as peace happens, and you can be reporting from Berlin that way." And then all travel stops for a time because of the planning for D-Day, and she again can't get there, and she doesn't wanna go and hang out in London. So it's February 1945 before she's able to go back, and this time she's an accredited war correspondent, which is a very different situation than reporting on the war from Berlin.
Mhm. And where did she get sent to?
They wanted her to use well, she was the war correspondent for two different organizations. One is McCall's Magazine, which sort of surprised me at the time because it was a woman's magazine, it was still a woman's magazine during my childhood, and it was, household and cleaning and
Oh.
children and stories, aimed at women, but they had a history of trying to do some hardcore reporting, and they wanted her to report on women in Germany and women in the war-torn areas, but then she also was a reporter for the Tribune, and they didn't want her to report on military action, they wanted her to tell the stories that in some ways only she could tell by using her connections to get behind the scenes stories about the war in Germany, and she did some amazing stories that way.
What is the story that stood out to you the most? The one that you
Ugh,
found the most?
the most compelling?
I mean, there's
That's
so many words you can use: painful, compelling.
painful. Yeah,
Yeah.
there is no doubt. There is absolutely one story that stands out,
Mm.
and that is her reporting on Buchenwald. She was part of a small group of reporters that belonged to a press camp run by the Air Force, and they flew those reporters into Buchenwald. They got there only a few hours after the Americans had freed the camp. And, I mean, it was horrible in all the ways you would expect it to be horrible. But her experience was really different from the other reporters who were part of that group, and again, it was because of her language skills. She was able to speak to the former prisoners in their own languages. So she's speaking to French prisoners, and she's speaking to Polish prisoners, and at one point, she hears someone behind her saying, "She speaks French, she speaks German, and nobody's talking to us," and they're saying it in Norwegian, and she turns around and says in kind of rusty Norwegian, "What do you wanna tell me?" So, and it's this small group of young Norwegian Jewish men who are the last remaining standing of a group of 500 who had been in one of the other camps and who had been walked to Buchenwald in a forced march after the Russians were getting close to Auschwitz. And, I mean, they were just so amazed to hear someone speaking Norwegian to them, and at first, there's just this moment of absolute joy and then the sorrow of explaining who they are. But the really powerful moment there, she's been speaking French. One of the Frenchmen comes up to her and asks her if she would go speak to men who were in a barracks that was set apart from the others. It was a group mostly French, a few Poles, and they were dying. And they were so ill that even though the American doctors who were there were already desperately trying to save people's lives, he knew they couldn't do anything to save these men. But he thought it would be good for them to hear a woman tell them in French that they were free. So she went to the barracks, and, yeah, she later said it was the most gruesome thing she had ever seen, and she saw some pretty gruesome stuff. There were 3 tiers of bunks of dying men, and the top bunks, blood and other fluids were leaking down onto the men below, and she knew there was nothing she could do to make them more comfortable, so just over and over again in French, she said, "You are free." And then something inspired her to add, "I just come from Paris. The chestnuts are in bloom in Paris." And a man managed to sit halfway up, and he stretched out a hand to her, and she came over and took it, and he said, "Is it true?" She said, "Yes, it's true. You're free. The American planes are coming." And he said, "The chestnuts are in bloom?" And she said, "Yes." And then he was gone.
Wow. That's such a beautiful story.
Yeah, that is hands down the most powerful story from her
Yeah.
reporting.
That's I love those stories because those stories often don't get told anymore. That's really like detailed one on one. Like that's the thing I mean, don't get me wrong, I love history, but like that's the thing with history though, we always see numbers. It's always like 20 million died, 17, 15, whatever, but we forget about those one on one. Yeah, it makes it so much more real.
Well,
That's
and
so
that's why
sad.
it's so important to tell individual stories
Yeah.
because it people can get their head around that in a way that they can't get their head around millions of people dying.
Mm,
We don't do millions of people very well. We do one dying man on a bunk, and
mm,
it gets us right in the gut.
yeah, for sure. Are those writings s- online for people to find? I think like many people who are watching this right now would love, well, I wouldn't say love, but they would be interested in finding them.
No. Well,
No?
her news articles are.
Mhm.
The Tribune articles are available in some of the historical newspaper accounts, and I literally started by reading every story that every byline story she had from the first one in 1919 all the way through to some in the '60s. Her Buchenwald story, they were only able to print a third of it because paper was so strictly rationed. And they stuck with the big horror, not the individual, and the pages she filed, her individual papers are not available online.
Those you actually went to the location itself to read them.
Absolutely,
Oh, wow.
absolutely.
That must have been like a whole adventure for you to do that.
It was. There's nothing quite like doing work in the archives.
Yeah, yeah, it makes it more real.
Yeah, yep, when you see the paper with the handwriting on it.
hmm Did she, like after the war, spend a lot of time trying to put light on these dark stories? Like, what did she spend her time doing after the war?
The after the war was difficult for her. She ended up resigning from the Tribune sh shortly after the Nuremberg trials began. She was back in the United States. She had a meeting with Colonel McCormick. They were talking about the trials, and he said, "We've got some officers who should be put on trial too." And she just kind of went, I'm sorry, Colonel, I can't agree with that." And when their conversation was over, she went down to the managing editor and she immediately resigned. And she probably could have gotten a job with one of the Tribune's competitors. I mean, she was a very well-known reporter at that point. But, she was 53, which was a lot older then than it is now. She was in poor health still, and she was the only child of an elderly mother who needed care. So instead of trying to get a full-time job as a foreign correspondent, she tried to put together a career as a freelance journalist and a Central Europe specialist. And, she had some success. She went back several times on reporting trips. She wrote for some national magazines. She made some appearances on radio and on television, when, a host wanted to talk about Germany for an American audience. But she really never quite made the transition to reporting in the post-war world. Um, And partially that was because her language skills and her network of sources weren't much use if you're in the United States. But it was mostly because she never was able to make the transition from Germany as the villain to the Soviet Union as the big bad in American foreign policy. And she did spend the rest of her life trying to talk about how dangerous Germany was and that it wasn't over. But at the time, that didn't seem real. It still doesn't seem real. Um, so she got stuck in a historical rut and
Mm,
and really was not a successful reporter at the end of her life.
that's sad to hear. I think a great way to end this conversation is um, I've got this quote from on your website. You said, "Over the last 4 years, I watched the rise of Nazi Germany through Sigrid's eyes and wondered if I would have been as courageous as she was. I hope I never have to find out. But if the time comes, I'll ask, what would Sigrid do?"